The night on Vega 9 was colder than usual, the kind of cold that crept under the skin and made every breath sting. The wind howled across the icy plains, carrying with it the eerie silence of a planet that had never truly welcomed human life. Lieutenant Kara Doyle pulled her jacket tighter and kept walking along the perimeter lights, her boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. She had been stationed on this distant colony for nearly 6 months, studying the alien ecosystem and ensuring that the base stayed safe from the dangerous creatures that roamed the wild. Most nights were quiet, uneventful, but something about this one felt different. Her scanner blinked faintly, showing a small cluster of heat signatures just beyond the camp fence. Her brow furrowed. Nothing was supposed to be out there. No patrol, no equipment, and certainly no life forms this close to the human perimeter. Cautiously, she stepped through the outer gate, her flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. The shapes on her scanner were small, uneven, and moving slowly. For a moment, she thought it might be damaged drones or scavenging birds. But as she drew closer, she saw movement in the snow. 3 tiny figures huddled together, trembling violently. Kara stopped dead in her tracks. The glow from their eyes was unmistakable. Predator cubs. Every report she'd ever read about them said they were fast, lethal, and untamable. The adult versions of these creatures had wiped out entire expeditions in the early colonization years. Yet here they were, barely the size of her arm, covered in frost and shaking from the cold. One lifted its head weakly, letting out a faint whimper that sounded far too soft for something that belonged to a predator species. For a long moment, Kara just stood there, unsure of what to do. Protocol demanded that she report them immediately and wait for the security team to arrive. But her instincts, the part of her that had joined the science division instead of the military, told her something else. She knelt down slowly, setting her scanner aside, and reached out a gloved hand. The cubs didn't growl or move. They just stared at her, their glowing blue eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. The smallest one struggled to lift its paw before collapsing into the snow. That sight pierced straight through her caution. "Easy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She removed her thermal blanket, the one she used to survive night patrols, and gently wrapped it around the cubs. The warmth seemed to surprise them. One of them nudged the fabric with its nose before curling closer to the others. The next cub shifted, pressing against her leg as if seeking shelter. Kara's breath caught. These creatures, once considered the deadliest species on Vega 9, were no threat tonight. They were just cold, frightened younglings fighting to survive. For the first time in years, she ignored her training and listened to her heart. Carefully, she lifted the bundle of cubs into her arms. Their tiny bodies were surprisingly light, but radiated a faint heat now that they were wrapped tightly. As she turned back toward the base lights flickering in the distance, she couldn't help but smile slightly. Kara knew what she was doing could get her in trouble. The regulations were clear. No contact with unclassified alien fauna. But as she walked back through the storm, shielding the cubs from the wind, she realized that some rules were meant to be broken. The little creatures stirred softly beneath the blanket, one letting out a quiet, almost content purr. For a moment, the harshness of Vega 9 didn't feel so cold anymore. In that silent, frozen night, Kara Doyle, a human alone on an alien world, had made a choice that would change everything. Kara stood in the howling wind, staring at the 3 small creatures huddled together in the snow. Every part of her training screamed for her to call it in, to alert command, to let the security team handle it. Predator species on Vega 9 were classified as extremely dangerous, even the young ones. A single wrong move could trigger an instinctive attack. She had read the reports. Stories of soldiers who got too close, thinking the cubs were harmless, only to never return. But as she watched the smallest one whimper, curling tighter into itself, something inside her shifted. It wasn't a threat. It was just a frightened baby, freezing to death. For a moment, the soldier in her hesitated, but the human in her couldn't stay still any longer. She took a slow step closer, careful not to startle them. The cubs looked up with glowing blue eyes, their fur crusted with frost, their breathing shallow. Kara could see that they were exhausted and starving. "Easy," she whispered softly, her voice trembling slightly. She knelt in the snow and carefully reached for her thermal blanket, unclipping it from her suit. The wind bit at her skin as she unwrapped it and laid it over them. One of the cubs flinched but didn't move away. Another let out a weak, almost pitiful sound, something between a cry and a sigh, and nestled closer to the warmth. The blanket was barely big enough to cover all three, but Kara adjusted it gently, tucking the edges around their tiny bodies. Their fur, once stiff with ice, began to soften as the heat seeped in. She could feel them trembling beneath her hands, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from relief. She knelt there for a while, the cold biting at her fingers, watching their slow breaths steady. A part of her mind kept warning her, "You're breaking protocol. This could end your career." Yet, looking at those helpless creatures, she knew she couldn't walk away. Not tonight. She remembered the briefing from her first day on Vega 9. Predators are not capable of empathy. They don't understand mercy. But what she was seeing didn't fit that belief. When one of the cubs lifted its head slightly and looked at her, its eyes didn't show aggression or hate. They showed confusion, maybe even trust. Kara exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. "You're going to be okay," she said quietly, almost as if she were talking to herself. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The snowstorm around her thickened, but she stayed put, crouched beside the cubs, shielding them as best as she could. The world around her seemed to fade. There was only the faint hum of the wind and the tiny rise and fall of their chests under the blanket. She had no idea what this moment would mean or what consequences would follow, but she knew one thing for sure. Leaving them there to die wasn't an option. When she finally stood up, her knees stiff from the cold, she took one last look at them. The cubs were asleep now, huddled close, their fur glistening under the dim light of the twin moons. Kara pressed her gloved hand against her chest and whispered, "You're safe now." As she turned back toward the colony lights in the distance, she felt the faintest sense of peace. She didn't know it yet, but this single act of kindness, one blanket shared in the cold, would change everything humanity thought it knew about predators and about compassion. The wind howled across the frozen plains of Vega 9, carrying sheets of snow that blurred everything beyond a few meters. Kara struggled against the storm, her arms wrapped around the small bundle in her jacket. The cubs stirred weakly, their tiny claws brushing against her suit as she hurried toward the only shelter nearby, an old maintenance hut that hadn't been used in months. The structure stood half buried in frost, its metal walls creaking in the wind. She pushed open the door, wincing as it groaned, and stepped inside. The air was bitterly cold, but at least it was dry. Carefully, she lowered the cubs onto the floor and secured the door against the storm outside. For a moment, the silence was heavy. Only the faint sound of her own breathing and the soft whimpers of the cubs filled the room. Kara switched on her portable heater, a small box-shaped device that emitted a low hum and a soft orange glow. It wasn't much, but the warmth began to push back the chill. She pulled off her gloves and rubbed her hands together before reaching for her pack. Inside, she had a few protein bars and a sealed ration of dried fruit. Not nearly enough for 3 hungry creatures, but it was all she had. She broke the bars into small pieces and placed them gently in front of the cubs. At first, they sniffed the food suspiciously, unsure if it was safe. Then the smallest one took a cautious bite, followed by another, until soon all 3 were eating quietly, their little jaws clicking softly in the stillness. Kara watched them, exhaustion tugging at her, but she couldn't stop smiling. These were supposed to be predators, dangerous, untamable, yet here they were, eating from her hands like lost children. When they finished, one of the cubs looked up and met her eyes. Its glowing blue pupils flickered in the dim light, and slowly it stepped closer. Kara didn't move, afraid of scaring it off. To her surprise, it gently pressed its nose against her hand and licked her fingers, a brief, unexpected gesture of trust. For the first time that night, she let out a small laugh. "You're welcome," she whispered softly. As the storm outside grew louder, Kara gathered the blanket and spread it out near the heater. She guided the cubs closer, one at a time, until they were curled up beside her. The warmth from their small bodies mixed with the heat from the machine, turning the icy hut into a fragile island of comfort in the endless cold. Kara leaned back against the wall, her eyelids heavy, but she refused to sleep. Every few minutes, she adjusted the heater and checked the blanket, making sure all 3 cubs were covered. They slept soundly, their breathing slow and steady except for one, the smallest, the mischievous one. It kept nudging the others, pushing them aside until it managed to claim the farthest corner of the blanket. When another tried to move closer, it let out a tiny growl, barely more than a squeak. Kara couldn't help but laugh quietly. "You're a little fighter, aren't you?" she murmured. The cub's ears twitched, but it didn't open its eyes. She reached over and adjusted the blanket once more, tucking them all in. For the first time in weeks, the endless isolation of Vega 9 didn't feel so heavy. As snow continued to batter the hut, Kara sat there in the faint orange glow, surrounded by 3 sleeping creatures that should have been her enemies. Instead, they had become her unexpected companions. She knew this moment wouldn't last forever, that questions and consequences would follow. But for tonight, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that in this frozen world, she had given warmth to something that needed it. And in return, they had given her a reason to believe that kindness could exist anywhere, even on Vega 9. The morning light crept through the cracks in the hut, casting faint golden lines across the cold metal walls. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Kara rubbed her tired eyes and stretched her stiff legs. The heater had long since shut off, but the cubs were still sleeping soundly beside her, wrapped in her blanket. Their small bodies rose and fell with steady breaths, no longer trembling from the cold. One of them had somehow managed to tangle itself entirely in the blanket, its claws clutching a corner like a child holding onto a favorite toy. Kara smiled faintly, her chest warming at the sight. She hadn't planned on keeping them, but now the thought of leaving them out in the wild again felt impossible. Stepping outside, she squinted against the pale morning light. The air was crisp and heavy with the scent of frost. She needed to grab more food and medical supplies from the nearby storage unit before the cubs woke. As she trudged through the snow, she glanced back once, feeling a quiet sense of pride mixed with fear. She knew what she had done was against every rule in the manual, but after what she'd seen, after hearing those little cries in the night, she couldn't regret it. Not yet. She hadn't gone more than a few dozen meters when a faint humming sound made her freeze. A patrol drone hovered above the ridge, its sensors scanning the landscape. Kara's heart sank. The hut's warmth, her heater, the cubs, and even her own body heat, would all show up on its scanners. She turned to run back, but it was too late. The drone's red light flickered, signaling a lock-on, and it flew off toward the base to report the anomaly. 2 hours later, the sound of approaching engines echoed through the still morning air. Kara stood outside the hut waiting, knowing there was no use hiding. A transport vehicle stopped a few feet away, kicking up snow as the doors opened. Colonel Reeves stepped out, his expression as cold as the wind around them, flanked by 2 armed guards. "Lieutenant Doyle," he said sharply, his tone cutting through the quiet. "Please tell me you didn't bring predators inside our perimeter." Kara straightened, her breath visible in the frosty air. "They're just cubs, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear twisting inside her. "They're not dangerous." Reeves narrowed his eyes and gestured for the guards to follow him inside. The moment they stepped through the door, the entire team froze. The cubs were still there, curled together peacefully on the floor, their glowing eyes blinking open one by one. One let out a sleepy yawn, another stretched lazily, and the third, the smallest one, tightened its grip on Kara's blanket and buried its face in the fabric. For a moment, no one spoke. The creatures, once thought to be ruthless killers, looked anything but. They were calm, almost gentle, their sleek fur glistening in the light from the half-open door. Colonel Reeves lowered his weapon slowly, disbelief crossing his face. "You're telling me," he said finally, "that those are the same species that tore apart Outpost 72 last year?" "Yes," Kara answered softly. "But they're not what we think they are. They protected me last night. and they understand more than we realize. She crouched beside the cubs, one of them leaning against her arm as if to prove her point. The security team exchanged uncertain glances. Reeves exhaled deeply, rubbing his temple. "You've broken about a dozen protocols, Lieutenant," he muttered. Kara nodded, her expression calm. "Maybe. But if breaking rules means saving lives, I'll take that risk." Reeves looked at her for a long time, then back at the cubs, still nestled in her blanket. The sight was something no one could have imagined. A human soldier and 3 predator cubs sharing warmth after a storm. Finally, he sighed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You might have just changed how we see this planet," he said quietly. Kara glanced down at the smallest cub, still clutching her blanket, and whispered, "Maybe they've changed us too." The moment Kara returned to headquarters, the entire base was already buzzing with rumors. News of what she had done had spread faster than the storm had passed. Some called her reckless, others called her brave. But to most, she was the officer who had brought predators, living weapons of nature, right into human territory. When she walked into the debriefing room, the atmosphere was tense. Officers stood around a large holographic table, their faces lit by the flickering blue light of surveillance footage. On the screen, the cubs could be seen huddled together in the quarantine chamber, looking small and harmless. Still, the room felt divided, as if one single word could decide their fate. Colonel Reeves was the first to speak. His tone was sharp, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Doyle," he began, "you violated at least 5 containment protocols and one of the highest security orders on Vega 9. Bringing those creatures inside our perimeter was not only dangerous, it could have been catastrophic." Kara stood tall. Her hands clasped behind her back, her face calm but her heart pounding. "Sir," she replied, "I understand the risk. But what I saw out there wasn't just instinct. It was something more. They were freezing, they were scared, and they chose to trust me instead of attacking." "That has to mean something." Across the table, a weapons officer slammed his hand down. "They're predators," he snapped. "Once they grow, they'll do what they were born to do. Kill. We've lost too many good soldiers to those things already." Another officer, an older scientist from the xenobiology division, spoke up softly. "And yet they didn't attack her. Isn't that worth studying? What if Lieutenant Doyle has found the key to communicating with them?" The room erupted in debate. Some argued for immediate termination, to destroy the cubs before they posed a threat. Others, mostly the research staff, pushed to keep them alive for observation. Kara listened quietly at first, then stepped forward. Her voice was calm but strong. "You call them monsters," she said, her gaze sweeping across the table. "But monsters don't show mercy. Monsters don't curl up beside someone who tried to save them. They were freezing to death, and they trusted me enough to stay. If that's not a sign of intelligence, of empathy, then maybe we've been the ones too afraid to see the truth." The room fell silent for a moment. Even Colonel Reeves, who rarely showed emotion, seemed taken aback by the conviction in her tone. Kara's hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from the weight of everything she had seen, from the desperate hope that her words might save those tiny lives. One of the scientists, a woman with silver hair and tired eyes, finally spoke. "If Lieutenant Doyle is right," she said softly, "this could change everything we know about this planet and about ourselves." Reeves paced slowly, glancing at the live feed of the cubs. One of them was batting curiously at the edge of the blanket she had left in the chamber. It looked anything but dangerous. He exhaled deeply. "This is not a decision I take lightly," he said at last. "But killing them now would teach us nothing. For the time being, they stay alive, under strict observation." A mix of relief and disbelief spread through the room. Kara closed her eyes briefly, letting out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The cubs would live, at least for now. Reeves turned to her, his tone firm again. "But, Lieutenant, this is on you. If anything goes wrong, you'll answer for it personally." Kara nodded without hesitation. "Understood, sir." As the others began to file out, still whispering their opinions, she looked once more at the live feed. The smallest cub had curled up tightly in the corner, the same way it had that night in the hut, clutching the blanket she had shared. A faint smile touched her lips. Maybe they didn't understand words or rules, but they understood warmth. They understood kindness. And as long as she was there, she was determined to prove that compassion could survive, even on a world built on fear. Time on Vega 9 always felt slow, but in the weeks that followed, something remarkable began to happen. The cold research base, once filled with tension and fear, started to feel almost alive. The cubs, who had arrived trembling and weak, were now growing stronger every day. Their sleek fur shimmered under the artificial lights, and their once cautious movements turned into playful curiosity. Kara spent most of her time with them in the observation bay, a reinforced room filled with sensors and cameras that constantly monitored their behavior. But to her, it wasn't a lab anymore. It was their home. Every morning when she entered, the cubs would perk up instantly, their glowing blue eyes lighting with recognition. One of them would always race to her first, bumping into her legs and growling softly in a way that sounded almost like a greeting. The others weren't far behind, circling her until she knelt down and greeted them all by name. She laughed more in those moments than she had in years. It was strange, almost unbelievable. These were the same creatures that the galaxy feared, and yet here they were, fighting each other just to get the first scratch behind the ear. They still loved her blanket. That old, worn piece of fabric had become the center of their tiny world. Every night, as the base lights dimmed and the colony settled into silence, Kara would find herself surrounded by the cubs, all trying to claim a piece of it. At first, they argued. Low growls, soft huffs, playful pushes. One would drag it to the corner, only for another to pounce and pull it back. But in the end, they always ended up together, curled around her like living heaters, their breathing steady and peaceful. Sometimes, when she couldn't sleep, she would just sit there quietly, watching them. The steady sound of their breaths, their warmth pressed against her side, it reminded her that even on this frozen planet, life had a way of finding comfort. What surprised Kara most wasn't just how the cubs changed, but how the people around her changed, too. Soldiers who had once called them monsters now stopped by the lab just to look through the glass. At first, they stood at a distance, hands still on their weapons, eyes wary. But curiosity has a way of breaking fear. One afternoon, a mechanic dropped by during his break, watching the cubs chase a small holographic drone across the floor. "Didn't think I'd ever see those things play fetch," he muttered, grinning. Soon others joined him, guards, medics, even scientists. Some brought toys or scraps from the mess hall. It wasn't long before laughter returned to the corridors, something the base hadn't heard in months. The tension that had once ruled every conversation was replaced by something new, a shared fascination, even hope. The cubs had become more than just a research subject. They were proof that life, no matter how fierce or wild, could adapt, could care, could connect. Kara didn't talk about it much, but she knew what it meant. She saw the way people looked at her when she passed, not with judgment anymore, but with quiet admiration. Some even thanked her, saying she'd brought warmth back to Vega 9 in more ways than one. She didn't take credit, though. Every time someone called her brave, she'd just shake her head and say, "It wasn't bravery. It was just the right thing to do." Still, when she sat with the cubs at night, the smallest one resting its head on her lap, the others sprawled across her blanket, she couldn't help but feel proud. What had started as one small act of compassion had rippled through the entire colony. These creatures, once seen as killers, were now symbols of peace, living proof that even the coldest worlds could be warmed by kindness. And deep down, Kara knew that as much as she had changed them, they had changed her far more. The night had been quiet, too quiet. The hum of the base's generators echoed softly through the metal halls, and outside, the twin moons of Vega 9 cast pale light over the frozen plains. Kara was finishing her nightly rounds, checking the cubs one last time before heading to her quarters. They were half asleep, curled around her blanket as usual, their tails flicking lazily. For a moment, she let herself relax, thinking about how far things had come, from that night in the storm to this fragile peace. But then the alarm shattered the silence. A deafening siren blared across the base, red lights flashing along every corridor. "Code Red! Perimeter breach!" a voice shouted through the intercom. "Unknown hostiles detected outside the north fence." Kara's heart jumped. She knew what that meant. A predator attack, not cubs. Not small creatures she could comfort with a blanket. These were full-grown beasts, the kind that had destroyed colonies before. Within seconds, soldiers were running through the halls, grabbing weapons and sealing blast doors. The air was thick with tension, and the distant sounds of gunfire echoed from outside. Before Kara could even react, she heard a low, sharp growl behind her. She turned. The cubs were awake, their eyes glowing brighter than she'd ever seen. They were restless, pacing back and forth, their instincts on edge. "Stay here," she said firmly, trying to block their path. But the cubs didn't listen. With sudden speed, they darted past her, their claws clattering against the metal floor. "No!" Kara shouted, sprinting after them. "Stop!" By the time she reached the outer corridor, the base doors had already opened for the defense team. Snow and smoke filled the air, and the blinding light of explosions flickered in the distance. The cubs raced straight toward the breach in the fence, toward the danger. Kara ran after them, shouting their names, but they didn't stop. And then she saw why. A massive predator, twice the size of any they'd ever captured, was charging toward a squad of soldiers who were pinned down behind a supply crate. The creature's claws tore through the frozen ground, its roar shaking the air. The soldiers were out of ammo, scrambling for cover. Just as the beast lunged forward, the cubs leaped between it and the humans. The impact shook the ground. Kara froze, watching in disbelief as the cubs fought. Not wildly, not blindly, but with purpose. The smallest one darted around the monster's legs, distracting it, while the other two lunged for its neck and tail. Their growls echoed through the storm, fierce and determined. They weren't attacking for territory or food. They were defending their home, their human family. One of the soldiers shouted, "They're protecting us!" But his voice was drowned out by the chaos. Kara ran toward them, firing her sidearm to help drive the creature back. It took the combined effort of soldiers and cubs to finally bring it down. When the noise stopped, the base fell eerily quiet again, just the sound of the wind and Kara's ragged breathing. She dropped to her knees beside the cubs. Two of them were injured, bleeding from shallow wounds. The smallest one limped toward her and pressed its head against her leg, purring weakly as if to say, "We're okay." The soldiers around them lowered their weapons, staring in disbelief. No one spoke for a moment. Then, one by one, they began to clap. The sound spread through the crowd, slow at first, then louder, echoing through the snow-covered field. Kara lifted one of the cubs into her arms, tears glistening in her eyes. "You brave little fools," she whispered, her voice breaking. As she carried them back inside, the applause followed her through the halls. People moved aside to make room, some reaching out to touch the cubs gently as they passed. They had risked their lives, not as test subjects or tamed creatures, but as protectors. That night, Vega 9 changed forever. Humanity's greatest fear had become its greatest ally. And as Kara laid the cubs down to rest, she knew one thing for certain. Loyalty wasn't born from training or orders. It came from something deeper, something shared, something human. The months that followed brought a quiet transformation across Vega 9, one that no one could have predicted. The once hostile planet, known for its deadly predators and frozen storms, had become a place of learning, cooperation, and most unexpectedly, hope. The cubs Kara had saved continued to grow, their once small frames now strong and majestic. Yet despite their size, they remained gentle toward the humans who had taken them in. They followed Kara everywhere she went, responding to her gestures, understanding her tone, and even recognizing her laughter. Soldiers who had once feared them now offered them scraps of food or playfully scratched their fur when passing by. The fear that had once ruled the colony had melted away, replaced by respect and connection. Scientists began studying the species closely, not as threats, but as potential allies. They discovered that the creatures possessed a deep emotional intelligence, capable of forming strong social bonds and understanding empathy. something rare, even among sentient species. Reports of Kara's work spread far beyond the icy plains of Vega 9. Other colonies started sending teams to learn from her methods, hoping to apply her compassion-driven approach to their own ecosystems. For the first time, humanity wasn't trying to conquer a planet. It was learning to coexist with one. Outside the colony gates, where Kara had once stood in a snowstorm clutching her blanket around 3 trembling cubs, a monument was built in her honor. It wasn't something she had asked for. In fact, she had argued against it. But the crew insisted. The statue was simple but powerful, a life-sized figure of Kara kneeling in the snow, her blanket spread open with 3 small cubs beneath it. They looked up at her with trusting eyes, just as they had that first night. The plaque beneath it bore an inscription that read, "Compassion breaks barriers no weapon can." Every time Kara saw it, her heart tightened, not out of pride, but out of humility. She didn't see herself as a hero. She saw herself as someone who simply chose kindness when fear was easier. Visitors began arriving from across the galaxy. Diplomats, students, and soldiers came to see the memorial. Some came out of curiosity, others out of gratitude, and many came because they needed hope. They stood before the statue, reading the inscription, and left inspired. Children especially loved visiting the site. Schools started teaching the story of the lieutenant and the predator cubs, reminding young minds that courage wasn't just about fighting, it was about caring. One teacher was quoted saying, "We trained soldiers to survive, but she taught the universe how to live." Kara never grew used to the attention. Whenever someone called her a hero, she would shake her head and smile softly. "I'm not a hero," she would say. "I just did what anyone should do when they see a life in need." When reporters once asked her what lesson she hoped people would learn from her story, she paused for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the smallest warmth can melt even the coldest hearts." As time passed, Vega 9 became known not as a world of danger, but as a symbol of unity between species. The cubs, now full-grown protectors of the colony, were often seen roaming the perimeter, keeping watch alongside human patrols. At night, when the twin moons hung low and the snow shimmered like silver dust, Kara would often visit the monument alone. She'd stand there quietly, her gloved hand brushing over the carved letters, and think about how far they had come, from fear to friendship, from isolation to understanding. It all began with a single moment. One woman, one blanket, and 3 frightened creatures in the snow. A moment of compassion that changed not just a planet, but perhaps the very meaning of humanity. And as the cold wind swept across the plains carrying whispers of the past, Kara knew that sometimes the simplest acts could echo louder than any battle ever fought.